The cardiac unit at Naval Medical Center, San Diego hummed with the controlled chaos of midnight shift. Fluorescent lights cast pale shadows across linoleum floors as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves walked the corridor, his chest tight beneath dress whites adorned with a Navy cross and 3 purple hearts. He wasn't supposed to be here. The reception was still going at the O Club. Admirals and senators celebrating his promotion to Rear Admiral Select, but something had pulled him back to these halls, where he'd spent 6 months learning to walk again after Kandahar. She moved between rooms with quiet efficiency, this nurse whose name tag read E. Vega. There was something about the way she carried herself, a precision in her movements that seemed almost military despite the cartoon-printed scrubs and the exhaustion evident in her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 35, though the overhead lighting aged everyone. What caught his attention, though, what made him pause mid-stride, was the chain visible at her collar, the dull glint of metal that seemed too heavy to be jewelry. "Excuse me." His voice carried the authority of 2 decades in naval special warfare. She turned, clipboard clutched against her chest, and he saw her stiffen almost imperceptibly. Not fear, recognition of rank. "That necklace you're wearing." Her hand moved to her collar instinctively, protective, fingers closing around something hidden beneath the fabric. "Sir." "I don't mean to intrude, but that's not a necklace, is it?" He stepped closer, and in the harsh light he could see the subtle scars along her jawline, the kind that came from shattered glass or shrapnel. The kind that told stories no one wanted to hear at cocktail parties. "It's nothing, Admiral, just something I keep close." Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath, like a wire pulled too tight. "I should check on my patients." "Staff Sergeant Vega." He said it quietly, reading the faded letters as she turned. The dog tag had slipped free, spinning slowly on its chain, but it wasn't her name stamped into the metal. The blood type was O positive. The religion line read no PREF, and the name worn but still legible in the fluorescent glare, Vega, ELENAM. She stopped walking. Her shoulders drew back in a posture that spoke of parade grounds and inspection lines, muscle memory that never quite faded. When she turned back to face him, her eyes held something he'd seen in mirrors for years. The weight of survival, the guilt of coming home when others didn't. "I flew Apache, sir, a lifetime ago." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Before I became someone's mom, before I became this." The hospital hummed around them, machines beeping their steady rhythms of life and death. Marcus Reeves, who'd led men through hell and learned to read the truth in silence, saw in her stance the ghost of a warrior trying to disappear into the ordinary world. The dog tag wasn't hers. He knew that now. It was a promise she wore like penance. "Tell me," he said, his admiral's voice softening into something more human, "about the pilot who wore that tag." 7 years earlier, the desert sunrise painted Afghanistan's Helmand province in shades of copper and blood. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vega pressed her forehead against the Apache's canopy, watching dust devils spiral across the valley floor 3,000 feet below. The radio crackled with morning traffic, call signs checking in across the battle space. Reaper 6, Viking 2-3. Her own call sign, Matter Actual, always drew the same tired jokes. "Matter, this is Paladin. Advise when on station for Overwatch." The ground commander's voice carried the flat professionalism of too many missions, too many close calls. "Paladin, Matter Actual, 2 minutes." Elena's hands moved across controls with the practiced ease of 800 combat hours. In the front seat, her co-pilot and gunner, CW2 Jackson Reeves, no relation to the SEAL they'd extracted last month, adjusted the targeting pod. Thermals picking up movement, grid November Victor 734, 821. Jackson's Mississippi drawl came through the intercom. "Could be farmers, could be trouble. Mark it, keep scanning." Elena brought the Apache into a wide orbit, the General Electric turbines singing their familiar song of controlled violence. Below, a convoy of MRAPs snaked through a narrow valley, Marines headed to a village where intelligence suggested a Taliban commander was hiding. Standard operation. Routine, if anything in Afghanistan could be called routine. The morning felt wrong, though. Alina couldn't articulate why, just a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her survival vest. She'd learned to trust that feeling during her first deployment, back when she was fresh out of flight school and stupid enough to think war had rules. Matter Paladin, we're getting intelligence updates. Possible IED activity along Route Hammer. A pause. Stay sharp up there. Jackson adjusted his helmet. Another day in paradise. At least the coffee was good this morning. Alina smiled despite herself. Jackson had a gift for finding humor in places it had no business being, a defense mechanism they all developed eventually. He was 26, engaged to a teacher back in Gulfport, already planning the ranch house they'd build near his family's land. He showed her photos constantly, this girl named Sarah with kind eyes and a smile that promised normalcy. The radio erupted with static, then voices overlapping in controlled panic. Paladin, this is Victor 3. We have troops in contact, northeast corner of village. Small arms fire, possibly RPGs. Request immediate air support. Matter, you're cleared hot. I say again, cleared hot. The ground commander's voice cut through the chaos with crystalline clarity. Alina's training took over, that seamless transition from observer to predator. Jackson, talk to me. Where are they? Working it, hold on. His fingers flew across the targeting display. Got 'em, marking now. 6, maybe 8 dismounts moving between buildings at grid November Victor 735-823. They're trying to flank the Marines. The Apache banked hard, and Alina felt the G-forces press her into the seat. Below, she could see muzzle flashes, tiny bursts of light that meant someone was trying to kill the men she was supposed to protect. The cannon came alive under Jackson's control, 30mm rounds chewing through mud walls with surgical precision. The sound, even through her helmet and the turbine roar, was a deep rhythmic thunder that resonated in her bones. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes of coordinated violence, of radio calls and target acquisition, of watching thermal images bloom white as bodies fell. When the silence returned, broken only by the Apache's engines and the crackle of burning structures, Alina felt the familiar emptiness that followed combat. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just the hollow knowledge that she'd done what was necessary. Paladin matter, targets neutralized. Marines are advancing. Her voice remained steady, professional, even as her hands trembled slightly on the controls. Good shooting matter, Paladin out. Jackson let out a long breath. Think we got them all. We got enough. Alina began her climb, pulling the Apache up and away from the valley. Standard procedure. Get altitude, assess the situation, be ready for whatever came next. The Taliban rarely fought alone. Where there was one cell, there were usually others. The explosion, when it came, was almost beautiful from 3,000 feet. A massive orange fireball erupted from the center of the convoy, the MRAP at the front disintegrating in a cloud of dust and debris. The shockwave rippled outward, and even at altitude Alina felt it through the airframe, a reminder that physics didn't care about armor or training or the families waiting back home. Jesus Christ, Jackson's voice cracked. That's Paladin's vehicle. The radio descended into chaos. Multiple casualties. Urgent CASEVAC needed. Alina was already diving, bringing the Apache down in a combat descent that would have earned her a safety violation anywhere but here. The cannon swiveled as Jackson searched for secondary threats, anyone trying to exploit the ambush. Matter, this is Viking 2-3. A new voice, younger, scared. We need immediate air support. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Paladin is down. I repeat, Paladin is down. Alina keyed the radio, forcing calm into her words even as her heart hammered. Viking, matter actual, we're overhead. Give me locations. Everywhere, they're everywhere. The Marine's composure shattered. and in the background she could hear screaming, the kind that came from men watching their friends die. "Viking, look at me. I need you to focus." Alina's voice cut through the panic like a blade. It was the voice she used with her daughter during nightmares, firm but gentle, the voice that promised safety even when the world was burning. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving. Now tell me where they're shooting from." A ragged breath. "North, buildings on the north side, and the ridgeline to the west." "Copy, stay down. We're engaging now." She glanced at her fuel gauge, did the quick mental math that every combat pilot learned. Enough for one more gun run, maybe two if they were lucky. Then they'd need to break for the forward arming and refueling point, leave these Marines alone for the 20 minutes it would take. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. Jackson worked the targeting pod with the precision of a surgeon marking enemies, calling distances, adjusting for wind that shifted the Apache's flight path. Alina flew like the aircraft was an extension of her body, muscle and metal moving as one. The cannon roared again, then the rocket pods, Hydra 70 screaming downrange to shatter the buildings where Taliban fighters had fortified. "Matter, Viking, that's doing it. They're breaking contact." Relief flooded the Marine's voice, the kind that came with temporary reprieve. "We need to get our wounded out. Can you cover the CASEVAC bird?" "Affirmative, we'll hold station." Alina checked fuel again. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if she pushed it. The Black Hawk medevac would need at least that long to arrive, load casualties, and get clear. "Alina," Jackson's voice was quiet over the intercom. "We're running low. We should probably head back, let someone else take the cap." "Not yet." She kept the Apache in its orbit, eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of renewed attack. The Taliban had a habit of waiting for moments like this, when everyone was focused on the wounded, when vigilance slipped just enough. "We stay until the CASEVAC is clear." "You know I trust you, but the math doesn't lie. We're cutting it close." "I know." She did know. Every pilot knew their bingo fuel, the point of no return where you either landed or fell from the sky. They were approaching that threshold with the inevitability of sunrise. But below, Marines were loading broken bodies into a helicopter that couldn't defend itself, and Alina had made a promise the day she put on wings. No one gets left behind. The Black Hawk arrived, its rotors beating the air into submission as it settled near the destroyed convoy. She watched through the Apache's sensors as corpsmen worked, as stretchers were loaded with practiced urgency. One of them looked up at her helicopter, just a faceless figure in camouflage, and rendered a salute that she couldn't return but felt nonetheless. "Matter, CASEVAC is up. Thanks for the cover." The Black Hawk pilot sounded tired, the weariness of someone who spent their deployment ferrying broken bodies between battlefields and hospitals. "Safe travels." Alina banked away, pointing the Apache toward base 30 miles distant. The fuel gauge showed numbers that made her stomach tighten. They'd make it, probably. The turbines would run on fumes and prayers if necessary. "Alina, we've got a problem." Jackson's voice carried a note she'd never heard before, something between fear and resignation. "Caution panel is lit up. Number 2 engine." She scanned her instruments and felt the bottom drop from her world. Engine temperature spiking, oil pressure falling, the helicopter beginning to vibrate with a rhythm that spoke of imminent failure. In the Apache, losing one engine meant you could fly. Losing both meant you became a very expensive rock. The decision tree of emergency procedures unfolded in Alina's mind with the clarity of countless training scenarios. Auto-rotation. Find a landing zone. Transmit Mayday. The desert below offered few good options, just rocky terrain and dried wadis where a helicopter could shatter like glass. She spotted a relatively flat area 2 miles ahead, began her descent even as the second engine's temperature climbed into the red. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Matter Actual. We have dual engine failure. Going down at grid November Victor 742-818. Her hands worked the controls, managing the descent, trading altitude for rotor speed, trying to cheat physics long enough to reach the ground intact. Jackson's breathing came fast over the intercom. "Elena, I'm sorry. I should have caught it earlier, should have." "Stop, not your fault. Just get ready for impact." She allowed herself one moment of human fear, 1 second to think about her daughter Sophia back in San Diego, 7 years old and waiting for a mother who might not come home. Then training reasserted itself, and she was just a pilot doing what pilots do, flying the aircraft until there was no aircraft left to fly. The Apache hit hard, harder than any training exercise, the landing gear collapsing and the fuselage sliding across rock and sand in a shower of sparks. The canopy cracked but held. Systems failed in rapid succession, displays going dark, the familiar cockpit becoming a tomb of shattered screens and failing electronics. When they finally stopped moving, the silence was absolute. "Jackson, you good?" Elena's voice sounded distant even to herself, shock beginning to assert its numbing influence. Yeah, I'm good," he groaned, moving in the front seat. "Nothing broken, you." "Same." She began running through shutdown procedures on instinct safing systems that were already dead. "We need to get out. Get the survival gear." They exited the wreckage, boots hitting sand that shimmered with midday heat. The Apache lay broken behind them, $32 million of American engineering reduced to scrap metal and leaking fluids. Elena pulled her rifle from its mount, checked the magazine, scanned the surrounding terrain with eyes trained to see threats before they materialized. "How long until they find us?" Jackson asked, already pulling the survival radio from his vest. "Couple hours if we're lucky, longer if the Taliban find us first." Elena didn't sugarcoat it. They were 30 miles from base, in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no friendly forces nearby. The scenario they'd trained for but hoped never to face. Jackson activated the radio, his hands shaking slightly. Any station, this is Matter 2. We are down, coordinates follow. Request immediate extraction. 2 souls. Say again, 2 souls." The radio hissed with static, then a voice broke through. "Matter 2, this is Viking 2-3. We copy your position. Help is coming. Stay alive." Elena almost laughed at that. Stay alive. As if they had any choice. She found a defensive position behind a rock outcropping, settled into a prone firing position, and began the waiting that was its own kind of combat. The first hour passed in tense silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional radio check. Elena and Jackson maintained a 360 security perimeter, rifles at the ready, watching the approaches for any sign of enemy movement. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace that sucked moisture from their bodies with malicious efficiency. "You think about it," Jackson asked suddenly. "What happens if they don't get here in time?" "Don't." Elena kept her eyes on the northern ridge, where shadows could hide a dozen fighters or just be shadows. "That kind of thinking gets people killed." "I'm supposed to marry Sarah in 3 months. She's got the dress already, the whole thing planned." His voice carried a desperate edge, the realization of mortality that combat made unavoidable. "I keep thinking about how she'll look in it." "Then think about it. Picture every detail. Keep that in your head." Elena understood the psychological warfare of waiting, how fear could be more destructive than bullets. "You're going to walk her down that aisle, Jackson. You're going to build that ranch house. You're going to have kids who'll think you're a hero." "What about you? What do you picture?" Elena thought of Sophia, her daughter's gap-toothed smile and the way she said, "I love you, Mama," every night before bed. She thought of the small apartment in San Diego they could barely afford, of school lunches and homework and parent-teacher conferences, the ordinary life she'd left behind to fly Apache through hostile skis. "I picture my daughter's graduation. High school, college, doesn't matter. I picture being there." She adjusted her grip on the rifle. "And I picture you and Sarah visiting us, bringing your kids so Sophia can babysit and complain about how much they pay her." Jackson laughed, a broken sound that held more hope than humor. Deal. You just have to hold up your end. The radio crackled. Matter 2, Viking 2-3. We have 4 F-18s on station for air support and a QRF launching from base. ETA 45 minutes. Can you hold? 45 minutes, an eternity in combat time. Elena keyed her radio. Viking Matter 2, we can hold, just tell them to hurry. But the Taliban had different plans. The first shot came from the north, a crack that sent rock chips flying near Jackson's position. Then another, and another, the methodical fire of someone who knew their weapon and wasn't in a hurry. Elena returned fire, controlled 3-round bursts aimed at muzzle flashes she more felt than saw. Contact north. Jackson's rifle joined hers, the sharp reports echoing off the rocks. Multiple dismounts spread out across the ridge. Elena assessed the situation with the cold calculus of combat. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. The crashed Apache offered minimal cover, and retreating meant exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions. Their only advantage was training and the knowledge that help was coming. If they could last that long. The firefight developed with the chaotic intensity of all close combat, disciplined training colliding with the primal need to survive. Elena fired, reloaded, fired again, her world narrowing to sight picture and trigger press, and the tactical geometry of angles and cover. Beside her, Jackson maintained his own rate of fire, calling out enemy positions in the flat tone that meant he'd found his professional calm. RPG. His warning came a half-second before the grenade impacted 20 meters to their left, the explosion showering them with rock fragments and dust. Elena's ears rang, but her hands kept working, muscle memory overriding the shock. Viking Matter 2, we are heavily engaged. Enemy force estimated 24 plus. We need that QRF now. She tried to keep the desperation from her voice, failed. Matter Viking, Hornets are overhead. They're going to make a show of force. Keep your heads down. The F-18s arrived like thunder made manifest, screaming across the desert at 500 knots and 500 feet. The sound of their passage, a physical blow that rattled teeth and suppressed enemy fire through sheer intimidation. Elena watched them climb and turn, gray predators against the blue sky, and felt a surge of hope. But the Taliban weren't impressed enough. The fire resumed, closer now, more concentrated. Someone was directing them, maneuvering to flank the downed aircrew's position. Elena shifted to cover the new threat, saw movement in her peripheral vision, squeezed the trigger and watched a figure fall. I'm hit. Jackson's voice was tight with pain. Ah, Christ, I'm hit. Elena low-crawled to his position, saw the blood spreading across his flight suit from a wound in his upper thigh. Not arterial, thank God, but bad enough. She pulled her medical kit, applied a tourniquet with hands that shook despite her training. You're okay, you're going to be okay. The lies we tell to keep people alive. Just keep breathing, stay with me. Elena, he grabbed her arm, his grip weak. If I don't make it, tell Sarah. Tell her yourself. That's an order, CW2. She tied off the tourniquet, tight enough to hurt, tight enough to stop the bleeding. You don't get to quit on me now. The radio broke through with new urgency. Matter 2, this is Guardian Angel. We're 2 minutes out with a full team. Mark your position with smoke if able. Elena pulled her last smoke grenade, purple smoke that would mark them as friendly to the incoming QRF. She threw it, watched the colored cloud billow skyward, a beacon of hope in the desert's indifference. Then she returned to firing, conserving ammunition now, making every shot count. The helicopter gunships arrived first, little birds that danced across the battlefield like angry hornets, miniguns spitting death at 6,000 rounds per minute. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped altogether as fighters broke contact and retreated into the hills. Elena kept her rifle ready, knowing that sometimes the silence after combat was more dangerous than the combat itself. The QRF Blackhawks settled into landing zones barely large enough to contain them, and suddenly there were Rangers everywhere. Professional violence on two legs, securing the perimeter and providing the overwhelming force that made further Taliban attacks suicidal. A medic reached Jackson first, taking over his care with practiced efficiency. Alina stood, legs shaking with adrenaline come down, and surveyed the wreckage of her Apache. It looked smaller now, less impressive, just twisted metal that had failed at the worst possible moment. But it had gotten them down alive, and in the end that was all that mattered. "Ma'am," a ranger sergeant approached, his rifle held with casual competence. "We need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" Yeah, I can walk." She moved toward the helicopter, each step an effort of will. Jackson was already loaded, the medic working over him with the intensity of someone fighting death personally. Alina climbed aboard, felt the Blackhawk lift, and watched the desert fall away below. In the hospital at Bagram, they told her Jackson would live. The bullet had missed the femoral artery by centimeters, a difference measured in fate and luck rather than skill. He'd go home, marry Sarah, build that ranch house he'd dreamed about. Alina visited him before his medevac flight, found him conscious and surprisingly cheerful despite the pain medication haze. "Hey, boss," he smiled weakly. "We made it." "We made it." Alina gripped his hand, felt the weight of shared survival, the bond that would connect them for whatever years remained. "You keep that promise. You marry that girl." "I will. What about you? What's next?" Alina didn't have an answer. She knew the army would investigate the crash, determine whether mechanical failure or pilot error had brought down the Apache. She knew her flying career might be over, that the injury statistics and risk assessments might ground her permanently. But none of that seemed important standing in this hospital ward, looking at a man who should be dead and wasn't. "I don't know, but I'll figure it out." She released his hand, stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Jackson." 3 days later, they gave her Jackson's dog tag. He'd asked the doctors to give it to her before he left, a piece of metal that represented everything they'd endured together. Alina held it, felt its weight, and knew she'd carry it always, not as a burden, but as a reminder that survival demanded witness. The investigation cleared her of wrongdoing. Mechanical failure, unavoidable, no fault assigned. But Alina knew the truth was more complicated. She'd pushed the fuel margins, stayed on station longer than procedure recommended, made the choice that saved Marines but endangered her crew. Command called it heroism. She called it the job. The nightmare started 3 weeks after her return to base. Alina would wake gasping, convinced she was still in the desert, still firing at shadows that moved with lethal intent. The flight surgeon prescribed sleeping pills, recommended counseling, hinted that maybe she needed time away from combat operations. Alina nodded through the appointments and continued flying, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led places she couldn't afford to go. Her commander called her in 6 months later, his expression unreadable behind a desk covered with deployment schedules and casualty reports. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been flying Apache since before Alina was born, had the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much and forgotten how to unsee it. "Alina, sit down." He gestured to a chair that had held countless other pilots receiving countless other pieces of bad news. "We need to talk about your next assignment." She sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap in the parade rest position that was more instinct than choice. "Yes, sir." "Your performance reviews are excellent. Your peers respect you. Your subordinates would follow you anywhere." Morrison paused, choosing words with visible care. "But I'm recommending you for instructor duty stateside. Rucker needs experienced combat pilots to train the next generation." The words hit like physical blows. Instructor duty, stateside, the gentle exile of pilots whose combat effectiveness was questioned, whose mental state made them liabilities rather than assets. Alina felt something crack inside her, a carefully maintained facade crumbling to reveal the exhaustion underneath. "Sir, I can still fly. I want to stay with my unit. I know you do, and I know you can fly, that's not the question. Morrison leaned forward, his voice softening. The question is whether you should. You've done 3 combat deployments, Alina. You've got 800 combat hours and a distinguished flying cross. You've earned the right to step back. What if I don't want to step back? The words emerged harder than intended, carrying all the frustration of feeling your purpose slip away. What if the only thing that makes sense anymore is flying? Morrison studied her with eyes that had seen this moment play out before, with other pilots in other wars who'd given everything and found nothing left to give. Then, I'd say you're exactly the kind of pilot who needs to step back, before the job takes more than you have left to lose. Alina wanted to argue, to insist she was fine, to maintain the fiction that war hadn't changed her in fundamental ways. But sitting in that office, wearing Jackson's dog tag beneath her uniform, she couldn't summon the energy for lies. The truth was she was tired. Tired of death. Tired of decisions measured in lives saved or lost. Tired of being afraid every time she strapped into an Apache that this would be the flight that didn't end with landing. When do I leave? Her voice was hollow. 30 days, enough time to transition your responsibilities. Morrison's expression held something like sympathy. Alina, this isn't punishment. You're not being pushed out. You're being given a chance to remember who you were before the war. Fort Rucker, Alabama, was everything Afghanistan wasn't. Green, safe, predictable. Alina spent her days in classrooms and simulators, teaching young pilots the lessons she'd learned in blood and fire. She was good at it, possessed the rare ability to translate combat experience into practical instruction without traumatizing students with war stories. But it felt hollow, like playing at being a pilot rather than actually flying. The loneliness was worse than combat. In Afghanistan, she'd been surrounded by people who understood, who'd seen the same things and carried the same weight. At Rucker, she was surrounded by people who thanked her for her service and changed the subject when she tried to talk about anything real. The isolation drove her inward until she was just going through motions, existing rather than living. Sophia noticed. Of course she noticed. Children have a gift for seeing through the masks adults wear. One evening, 2 years into Alina's instructor assignment, her daughter looked up from homework and asked the question Alina had been avoiding. "Mommy, are you sad?" Alina froze, caught between truth and the protective instinct that made parents lie to their children. She was sitting at their small kitchen table, nursing cold coffee and staring at nothing, the same position she'd held for the last hour. "Sometimes, baby, sometimes mommy is sad." Because of the flying, Sophia had inherited her mother's directness, the inability to dance around difficult topics. "Because you don't fly the helicopters anymore." "Yeah, because of that." Alina pulled her daughter close, breathed in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "But I have you, and that makes everything better." It wasn't entirely a lie. Sophia did make things better, but there was a hole inside Alina that her daughter couldn't fill, a piece of her identity that had been carved away and lost somewhere in the Afghan desert. She was Alina the instructor, Alina the mother, Alina the veteran. But she wasn't matter anymore, wasn't the pilot who'd held station while fuel ran low and kept promises even when they cost everything. The years passed in a blur of lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, of simulator hours and weekend soccer games. Alina dated occasionally, men who appreciated her service and called her inspiring and never quite understood why she'd wake screaming some nights, why she flinched at loud noises, why she wore a dog tag that wasn't hers. The relationships never lasted. She was 33 when she left the Army, accepting a medical retirement for PTSD that felt like admitting defeat. The ceremony was small, just a handful of former squadron mates and Sophia watching, as Alina's commander presented her with a folded flag and thanked her for her service. She shook hands, accepted congratulations, and drove away from Fort Rucker feeling like she'd left a part of herself behind that she'd never recover. The nursing program accepted her application 3 months later. Alina had always been good with biology, with understanding how bodies worked and broke, and the GI Bill made education possible. It wasn't flying, but it was purpose, and purpose was something she desperately needed. She threw herself into studies with the same intensity she'd once brought to flight school, memorizing anatomy and pharmacology, learning to save lives in different ways. Sophia adapted to their new life with the resilience of children raised by single parents. She understood, in the way children do, that mommy had to work a lot, had to study late, had to sometimes space out mid-conversation when helicopters flew overhead. She learned to give her mother space during the bad days, when Alina would stare at Jackson's dog tag and remember things she couldn't forget. The Naval Medical Center hired Alina straight out of nursing school. It felt right, being back among military patients, understanding their particular brand of gallows humor and stoic pain. She worked cardiac care, helping sailors recover from heart attacks and surgeries, monitoring vitals and administering medications in the pre-dawn hours when hospitals existed in their own temporal space. It was good work, necessary work, but it wasn't flying. She was doing rounds when she saw him, this SEAL admiral whose face she recognized from news coverage of some operation in Syria. He walked with the controlled violence of special operations personnel, even in dress uniform, even in a hospital corridor far from any battlefield. Alina recognized him because she recognized herself. Someone trying to figure out who they were when the war was over, but the war never really ended. When he stopped her, when he asked about the dog tag she wore like a talisman, Alina felt something shift. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, without pity or judgment, just the clear-eyed assessment of one warrior evaluating another. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying secrets for so long, of pretending to be just a nurse, just a mom, just an ordinary person when she'd once been extraordinary. "I flew Apache, sir, a lifetime ago." The words emerged unbidden, breaking years of careful silence. "Before I became someone's mom, before I became this." Admiral Reeves studied her with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable from anyone else. But Alina had been studied before, by commanders evaluating her fitness, by therapists assessing her trauma, by men deciding whether she was worth knowing beyond her uniform. This felt different. This felt like being seen. "Tell me," he said, voice carrying command and compassion in equal measure, "about the pilot who wore that tag." So she told him, standing in a hospital corridor at 0200, surrounded by the sounds of machines keeping people alive. Alina told the story she'd been carrying alone, about Jackson and the downed Apache and the firefight that should have killed them both, about 45 minutes of combat that had defined every moment since, about a young man who'd gone home to marry his sweetheart and build his ranch house, who'd kept his promises while she'd lost herself. Reeves listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or false comfort. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and Alina realized she'd said too much, had unloaded on a stranger who'd only asked a simple question. She stepped back, preparing to apologize and retreat, but he spoke first. "I was there, not with you, different sector, but I was there." His eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare she saw in mirrors. "My team got hit extracting a downed pilot. We lost 3 good men getting him out. I've worn their names on my body ever since." He touched his chest, where Alina knew there would be scars or tattoos or both. Different war, same weight. Understanding passed between them, the silent recognition of shared burden. Alina felt something unknot in her chest, a tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Someone else knew. Someone else understood. "Why nursing?" Reeves asked. "After everything, why this?" Alina touched the dog tag, felt its familiar weight. "Because I couldn't save everyone in the air, so I figured I'd try saving them on the ground. It's not the same, but it's something." "It's not nothing." Reeves's voice carried conviction. "You're still serving, just in a different uniform." They talked until her shift ended, until the sun rose over San Diego, and the hospital transitioned from night to day. Reeves told her about his own transition from combat to command, about learning to lead from behind desks instead of from the front, about finding purpose in teaching others to do what he could no longer do himself. Alina told him about Sophia, about single motherhood and nursing school, and the strange life she'd built from the wreckage of who she'd been. When they finally parted, Reeves made her promise something. The Navy's looking for experienced military pilots to train with new helicopter platforms. Consulting work mostly, but it would get you back in the air. Would you be interested? Alina's heart stuttered, flying again. The possibility seemed impossible, dangerous, everything she tried to leave behind. But it also felt like a door opening, a chance to reclaim something she'd thought lost forever. I don't know if I can, sir. It's been years, and there's Sophia to think about. Think about it. Reeves handed her his card, Admiral's insignia embossed in gold. You were matter actual, that pilot's still in there somewhere. Maybe it's time she flew again. Alina didn't call for 3 months. She kept the card in her wallet, pulled it out sometimes during lonely shifts, traced the embossed lettering and tried to imagine herself back in a cockpit. The fear was real. Not of flying, but of discovering that the pilot she'd been was gone, replaced by someone who'd forgotten how to be that brave. It was Sophia who made the decision inevitable. 10 years old now, wise beyond her years, she found her mother staring at the card one evening and asked the obvious question. Is that about the helicopters? Alina looked at her daughter, this fierce, brilliant child who'd grown up with a mother haunted by choices and burdened by survival. Yeah, baby, it's about the helicopters. Are you going to call him? No judgment in Sophia's voice, just curiosity and perhaps the hope that her mother might find some piece of happiness that had been missing. I don't know. What do you think I should do? Sophia considered this with the seriousness she brought to difficult questions. I think you should do what makes you happy, Mommy, even if it's scary, maybe especially if it's scary. Alina called the next day. Reeves answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who lived in 15-minute increments. Admiral Reeves. Sir, this is Alina Vega. You gave me your card 3 months ago at the medical center. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. I'd like to talk about that consulting position. There was a pause, and she could hear the smile in his response. Outstanding. Can you meet me tomorrow at North Island? I'll give you a tour of what we're working on. The test flight happened 2 weeks later. Alina sat in the right seat of an Apache Guardian, the newest variant with upgraded engines and digital systems, feeling the familiar vibration of rotors spooling up. The young pilot beside her, a warrant officer who couldn't have been more than 25, treated her with the deference due to legends and old warriors. Ma'am, controls are yours whenever you're ready. He released the cyclic, waiting. Alina's hands found their positions through muscle memory, her feet settling on pedals that felt like coming home. The fear was there, cold and sharp, but underneath it was something else, recognition. This was who she was, not just a nurse, not just a mother, but this. Matter actual back where she belonged. She pulled pitch and felt the Apache leave the ground, felt gravity release its hold, felt 7 years of exile fall away like discarded armor. The sky opened above her, infinite and forgiving, and Alina flew. Below, Admiral Reeves watched from the flight line, this woman who'd worn another pilot's dog tag like penance, and remembered why he'd fought so hard to get her here. Some people were meant to serve on the ground. Others were meant to fly. Alina Vega was the latter, and the sky had been waiting for her return. The consulting work grew into something more permanent. Alina spent 6 months helping develop new training protocols, combining her combat experience with current doctrine, teaching young pilots lessons learned in blood. The Navy, impressed with her work and desperate for experienced helicopter instructors, offered her a commission. Commander in the Navy Reserve, with the possibility of activation if needed. Alina accepted, signed papers that felt like marriage vows, and found herself back in uniform. Different service, same commitment. Sophia, now 11, watched her mother pin on rank insignia with pride mixed with worry. She'd heard enough stories to know that uniforms meant danger, that service meant sacrifice. "You're not going back to the war, are you?" Sophia asked that evening, her voice small. Alina pulled her daughter close, felt the weight of promises made and kept. "No, baby, not unless there's no choice, but I need to fly. I need to teach others how to fly safely. Can you understand that?" "I understand." Sophia's voice was muffled against her mother's shoulder. "Just promise you'll come home." "Always, I will always come home to you." It was a promise Alina meant with every fiber of her being, even knowing that combat made liars of everyone who deployed. But she also knew that living half a life, trapped between who she'd been and who she'd become, was its own kind of death. She needed the sky the way some people needed air. The years that followed were good ones. Alina flew, taught, raised her daughter, and slowly discovered that identity wasn't binary. She could be Mater and Commander Vega and Alina and Mom all at once. The nightmares faded, not disappearing but becoming manageable. She dated, fell in love once or twice, let people close enough to see her scars. Jackson visited sometimes, bringing Sarah and their 3 kids to stay in San Diego's eternal summer. He walked with a slight limp now, souvenirs of the bullet that had nearly killed him, but he'd built his ranch house and lived the life he'd dreamed about in the Afghan desert. He and Alina would sit on her small apartment balcony, drinking beer and not talking about the things they'd seen, the comfortable silence of people who'd survived together. "You seem good," Jackson said during one visit, 5 years after Alina had returned to flying. "Better than that hospital." "I am good, finally." Alina touched the dog tag at her throat, his name worn smooth by years of friction. "Took a while to figure out, but I got there." "You ever think about giving that back?" He nodded at the tag. "I know why you kept it, but maybe it's time." Alina considered this. The dog tag had been penance, memorial, and talisman all at once, but maybe Jackson was right. Maybe holding onto the past so tightly prevented living in the present. "You want it back?" "Nah," Jackson smiled, the easy grin that had sustained them through combat. "You keep it, just don't let it keep you." The call came on a Tuesday morning, Admiral Reeves on the line with news that would reshape everything. "Alina, I need a favor. The kind you can absolutely refuse, but I'm asking anyway." She'd learned to read him over their years working together, could hear the weight behind his words. "What kind of favor, sir?" "We're standing up a new pilot training program, advanced combat tactics focused on survival and emergency procedures, real-world scenarios based on recent operations." A pause. "I want you to head it. Full-time position, commander to captain promotion based at Miramar. You'd be training the trainers, the pilots who'll teach the next generation." Alina's breath caught. Captain, 4 stripes, command of a major training initiative. It was everything she'd never let herself want, success measured not in missions flown but in pilots trained, in lives saved through knowledge passed down. "Sir, I'm honored, but—" "Before you say no, think about this. How many pilots could you have saved if someone had taught you what you learned in combat? How many Jacksons could come home intact if their instructors knew what you know?" The question landed with surgical precision, cutting through Alina's doubts to expose the truth underneath. She could do more good teaching than flying. She could pass on lessons bought with blood and fear, could give young pilots the tools they'd need to survive what she'd survived. "When do I start?" Her voice was steady, certain. "Whenever you're ready, Captain," she could hear Reeves smiling. "Welcome to the next phase." The promotion ceremony happened 3 months later, Sophia pinning Captain's eagles on her mother's shoulders while former squadron mates and students watched. Alina looked out at the assembly, saw Jackson and Sarah with their kids, saw Admiral Reeves standing proud, saw the future she'd built from the ruins of the past. When she spoke, accepting the promotion and new command, her words were simple. I flew in Afghanistan as matter actual. I crashed, fought, and came home when others didn't. That pilot wore someone else's name as a reminder of what survival costs. Now I get to teach others how to survive, how to bring their crews home, how to be the pilots who make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. This is my honor. This is my purpose, and I will give everything to prepare them. The applause was genuine, the respect earned through combat and time. But what mattered most to Alina was Sophia's face, shining with pride, understanding finally why her mother needed the sky. That night, alone in her apartment, Alina held Jackson's dog tag one final time. Then carefully, reverently, she placed it in a shadow box alongside her medals and wings, preserving it as history rather than wearing it as burden. The pilot who needed that reminder was gone, replaced by someone who'd integrated her past instead of being haunted by it. Matter Actual had flown again, had found purpose, had transformed survival into service. And in the morning, Captain Alina Vega would begin teaching others to do the same.